A flight attendant, accustomed to reading passengers at a glance, questions the identity of a poised black woman sitting in first class. What begins as a casual check spirals into an uncomfortable confrontation when subtle biases surface, leaving the cabin tense with unspoken judgment. The woman, Sarah Daniels, a celebrated author and philanthropist, stays composed but firm, quietly dismantling the flight attendant's assumptions. Yet it's not until a small, unexpected discovery, a worn book, its cover bearing Sarah's name, that the truth unravels and changes everything. What happens next not only transforms the lives of those on board but also sparks a movement that challenges the boundaries of prejudice, grace, and understanding. Stay tuned for the story that shows how one moment of reckoning at 30,000 feet became a catalyst for justice and empathy. Comment below where you're watching from, and if stories of courage and transformation inspire you. Don't forget to subscribe for more. This is a journey you'll never forget. The terminal buzzed with the sound of announcements and hurried footsteps as Amara Blake stepped through Gate 21. Her boarding pass in one hand, her worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She was dressed in a simple navy blazer and slacks, the kind of outfit that blended into any professional crowd. In her other hand, she clutched a dog-eared copy of her book, Rise Above, a memoir that had propelled her from the shadows of her Harlem upbringing to national prominence as an author and philanthropist. Today's flight was supposed to be routine Boston to Chicago, a stopover before an important meeting to secure funding for her scholarship program. But Amara couldn't shake a strange, simmering unease. She approached the gate agent with her usual grace, passing her boarding pass to the young man behind the counter. He barely glanced at her, stamping it with mechanical efficiency before waving her through. It wasn't until she stepped into the jet bridge and approached the first-class cabin that the air seemed to change, thickening with an intangible tension. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the flight attendant at the door said, her voice clipped but polite. Her name tag read Lisa Warren. Lisa's blonde hair was twisted into a tight bun, her uniform spotless, yet it was her eyes sharp and probing that gave Amara pause. Lisa's gaze lingered a moment too long, flickering between Amara's face and the boarding pass she extended. "May I see your ticket again?" Lisa asked, her smile polite but tight, her words laced with something unspoken. Amara hesitated for only a second, then handed over her boarding pass with steady hands. She had faced these moments before. Moments where questions felt less about procedure and more about boundaries. Unspoken but unmistakable. Lisa examined the ticket as if searching for an error. "This is for seat 3A?" she asked, the faintest arch of disbelief in her tone. "That's correct," Amara said, her voice calm, though she felt a flicker of heat rising in her chest. Lisa stepped aside, but the air felt colder as Amara moved to her seat. First class was quiet, its leather seats filled with middle-aged professionals absorbed in laptops and newspapers. Amara settled into her spot, placing her satchel under the seat and her book on the armrest. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to focus on the meeting ahead. But peace was fleeting. Lisa returned moments later, hovering near Amara's row. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her tone softer but still insistent. "I just need to double-check. You're traveling alone today?" Amara's fingers tightened slightly on her armrest. "Yes, I am. Is there a problem?" "No, not at all," Lisa replied quickly, though her face betrayed unease. "It's just unusual to see someone with no luggage in first class. That's all." Amara held her gaze, letting a beat of silence stretch between them. "I prefer to travel light." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course. Enjoy your flight." She walked away, but not without casting one last glance over her shoulder. The tension in the cabin began to ripple outward. A silver-haired man across the aisle raised his eyebrows at his seatmate, who responded with a subtle shake of her head. 2 rows back, an elderly woman whispered, "That didn't feel right." Amara opened her book, pretending to read, but the words blurred on the page. Her mind was already racing, replaying Lisa's tone, her questions, the faint, lingering doubt that clung to her like a shadow. The murmurs of nearby passengers faded as the plane taxied to the runway. Amara closed her eyes, willing herself to focus on the meeting that awaited her. But then Lisa's voice came again, cutting through the hum of the engines. "This place isn't meant for people like you." The words were soft, almost whispered, but they pierced the quiet like a sharp blade. Amara's eyes snapped open. She turned her head, slowly, to see Lisa walking away, her posture stiff, as if bracing for impact. Around her, a heavy silence had fallen. The elderly woman 2 rows back gasped audibly, her hand clutching her pearls. "Did she just—" the woman began, her voice trembling. Amara straightened in her seat, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, some curious, others averted in discomfort. She thought of her mother, Grace Blake, who had taught her to pick her battles wisely. Not here, not now, Amara told herself, though the weight of Lisa's words sat heavy in her chest. But the moment refused to pass quietly. A young woman in the row ahead turned slightly, her phone in her hand, recording the aftermath. Across the aisle, the silver-haired man leaned toward his wife, whispering. That was out of line. Amara didn't speak. Instead, she opened her book again, this time reading with deliberate focus. It was her armor, her way of saying without words that she would not be diminished. But the tension in the cabin was palpable, the air thick with unspoken judgments and silent questions. Lisa, standing at the front of the cabin, avoided Amara's gaze. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for another passenger, the enormity of her actions beginning to sink in. But pride held her tongue, even as guilt began to coil in her stomach. As the plane climbed into the sky, Amara sat upright in her seat, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. She had faced moments like this before, moments that tested her dignity and patience. But this time, something felt different. At 30,000 feet, she realized there was no easy way to escape the confrontation brewing in the narrow aisle of this plane. The hum of the engines grew louder, matching the rhythm of Amara's heartbeat. She closed her book, placing it gently on the armrest, her mind already shifting. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something far larger. Something that had followed her through every boardroom, every lecture hall, every street corner where someone dared to wonder if she truly belonged. The flight was only beginning, but the battle lines had been drawn. The soft hum of the plane's engines provided a backdrop to the subtle tension that rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers busied themselves with their devices or drinks, yet the charged atmosphere lingered like static in the air. Amara Blake adjusted her seatbelt and opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. But her mind wasn't on her work. Instead, it replayed the flight attendant's words, the sharp edge of them cutting deeper with every recollection. At the front of the cabin, Lisa Warren busied herself with mundane tasks, straightening napkins, checking drink supplies, but her movements were mechanical, her mind a whirl of unease. She had meant for the words to stay in her head, not escape her lips, but they had, and she couldn't take them back. Now, the weight of what she'd said, and the reaction she'd provoked, bore down on her like the pressurized air surrounding the plane. Lisa glanced at Amara from the corner of her eye. The woman sat still, composed, her face a mask of calm. But Lisa could sense the turmoil beneath the surface. It wasn't guilt that gnawed at Lisa, at least. Not yet. It was defensiveness. I didn't mean it that way, she told herself. She's making this into something bigger than it is. But the murmurs from other passengers suggested otherwise. Across the aisle, the silver-haired man from earlier leaned toward his wife. She doesn't look like she's causing trouble, he murmured. Why would the attendant single her out? His wife frowned, her voice barely audible. It's not about what she's done. It's about who she is. The couple's exchange landed in Lisa's ears like a pebble dropped in water, sending ripples of irritation through her chest. She straightened her spine, forcing a smile as she approached the couple to take drink orders. They both declined, their gazes avoiding hers. Lisa's smile faltered. The air felt thicker, her uniform heavier. Meanwhile, Amara typed a few words, then backspaced. She wasn't focused. Her book, resting on the armrest, stared back at her like a silent reminder of her mission. She had written rise above to empower others, to remind them that they were more than the labels society placed on them. Yet here she was, thousands of feet in the air, struggling not to let those same labels weigh her down. A soft ping broke the silence, signaling that the captain had turned off the seatbelt sign. Passengers stirred, stretching or standing to retrieve bags from the overhead compartments. Lisa took the opportunity to disappear into the galley, where she leaned against the counter, her heart pounding. What's wrong with me? She whispered, gripping the edge of the sink. She thought of her training, of the countless hours spent learning how to handle difficult passengers, medical emergencies, even unruly behavior. Yet none of that had prepared her for the quiet confrontation of her own prejudices, reflected back at her in the poised demeanor of a woman she'd unfairly judged. Lisa's thoughts were interrupted by a ding from the intercom. "Lisa, could you please come to the cockpit?" the pilot's voice crackled. Grateful for the reprieve, she smoothed her uniform and headed to the front of the plane. As Lisa left, a younger woman seated near the back of first-class rose and approached Amara. Her hair was dyed a vibrant purple, her nose ring glinting in the cabin's soft light. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but insistent. "I just wanted to say I saw what happened. It wasn't okay." Amara looked up, surprised. The woman's face was earnest, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Thank you," Amara said, her voice measured. "But I'm fine." The younger woman frowned. "You shouldn't have to be." Amara held her gaze for a moment, then offered a small, tight smile. "I appreciate your concern, truly." The woman hesitated, then nodded and returned to her seat. Amara exhaled softly, her fingers brushing the edges of her book. She appreciated the gesture, but she also knew how fragile these moments could be, how easily the narrative could shift, turning her from the wronged party into the angry black woman, if she didn't tread carefully. The cabin settled again, but not entirely. Whispers floated between rows, glances darting toward Amara, then away. The tension was no longer just between her and Lisa, it had spread. A silent acknowledgement of the elephant in the room. Lisa returned from the cockpit, her face pale but her expression set. She avoided Amara's row as she passed through the cabin, her steps quick and precise. But as she reached the back galley, she overheard a passenger's whispered comment. "Do you think she's going to file a complaint?" "Wouldn't blame her if she did," another voice replied. Lisa's chest tightened. She couldn't escape it. The weight of her actions followed her, growing heavier with each step, each glance, each murmur. She leaned against the galley wall, her breathing shallow. For the first time, she began to question herself, not just her actions, but the beliefs that had led her here. Why did I hesitate with her? Why did I question her ticket, her presence, her belonging? The answers, murky and uncomfortable, stirred uneasily in her mind. Back in her seat, Amara closed her laptop and reached for her book. She wasn't angry, not in the way people often expected, but she was tired. Tired of the quiet battles, the endless negotiations of dignity and worth. She had hoped this flight would be a reprieve, a moment of calm before the storm of her meeting. Instead, it had become yet another stage on which she was forced to perform resilience. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting slightly. Lisa steadied herself in the galley, her thoughts snapping back to the present. She knew she had to do something. Apologizing seemed like the right thing, but the thought terrified her. What if she made it worse? What if Amara dismissed her? Or worse, called her out in front of everyone? The turbulence passed, and the cabin returned to stillness. But for Lisa and Amara, the storm was far from over. It churned within them, unspoken but palpable. As the plane soared through the night sky, the journey had only just begun, and the reckoning it carried was unavoidable. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into its cruising altitude, casting a soft glow over the first-class cabin. Amara Blake flipped through the pages of her book, her movements deliberate, as though forcing herself to appear calm. But inside, her thoughts raced. The quiet insult still echoed in her mind. "This place isn't meant for people like you." She had heard worse in her life. Growing up in Harlem, she'd seen doors close before she even had a chance to knock. She had learned to keep her head high, to pick her battles carefully. Yet here, in this confined space, at 30,000 feet, the insult felt sharper. It wasn't just the words, it was the assumption behind them, the casual ease with which they had been spoken, as though they were truth. Across the aisle, Lisa Warren fidgeted with her uniform. She avoided looking in Amara's direction, her mind replaying the scene over and over. She told herself it wasn't as bad as she feared, that the passenger likely didn't even care. Yet every time her eyes drifted to Amara, her stomach churned. Amara's calm was unnerving, her silence heavy with unspoken judgment. Lisa turned toward the galley, hoping to find refuge in the familiar routine of her duties. But even there, the tension followed her. A younger flight attendant, Mark, stood near the coffee machine, His brow furrowed as he glanced toward the cabin. "Everything okay out there?" he asked. His voice low. Lisa hesitated, pretending to adjust a tray of cups. "It's fine," she replied quickly. Her tone clipped, but Mark's expression didn't change. He had seen Lisa's exchange with Amara. He had heard the whispers among the passengers. His silence was a mirror, reflecting back Lisa's discomfort. Back in her seat, Amara's focus wavered. She wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but she had spent a lifetime navigating moments like this. Moments where she had to decide whether to speak up or let the slight slide by. Is this worth it? She wondered. Her meeting tomorrow was critical. She couldn't afford to arrive rattled. Yet something inside her stirred a quiet voice that refused to be silenced. The soft chime of the intercom broke the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The announcement gave Lisa an excuse to leave the galley. She moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and trays, her professional mask firmly in place. But as she approached Amara's row, her steps slowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a nearby passenger's tray table. She could feel Amara's presence like a weight, her silence speaking volumes. "Everything okay here?" Lisa asked, forcing a smile as she finally reached Amara's seat. Amara looked up, her eyes calm but piercing. "Fine," she said simply, her tone neutral. Lisa hesitated, as if waiting for more. But when none came, she nodded and moved on, her chest tight with a mix of relief and unease. The plane jolted, the turbulence more severe than expected. Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers gripped their armrests. Lisa hurried back to the galley, her heart racing. She clung to the counter as the plane rocked, her thoughts spinning. The turbulence outside mirrored the storm within her, the growing realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Amara closed her book and leaned back in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrests tightly. The physical turbulence felt almost symbolic, shaking loose the emotions she had tried to suppress. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Don't let them take your peace. Baby, it's yours, not theirs." But peace felt distant now, overshadowed by the weight of this moment. The turbulence subsided, but the cabin remained tense. Amara noticed the glances from other passengers, the couple across the aisle, the young woman with purple hair a few rows ahead. Their expressions were a mix of sympathy and uncertainty, as though they were waiting for her to make a move. And then, as if on cue, the young woman stood again. She approached Lisa in the galley, her voice loud enough to carry. "You should apologize," she said bluntly, her tone firm. What you said to her was wrong. Lisa's face flushed. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice barely masking her irritation. "You heard me," the woman said. "That passenger Amara, she didn't deserve that. You owe her an apology." Passengers began to stir, their attention drawn to the unfolding confrontation. Lisa glanced around, her pulse quickening. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight, "but I was just doing my job." "Your job?" the woman shot back. "Is it your job to make people feel like they don't belong?" "Ma'am, please lower your voice," Lisa said, her tone defensive. "You're disrupting the cabin." The woman scoffed but returned to her seat, muttering under her breath. Lisa exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the counter. She felt the eyes of the cabin on her. The unspoken judgment she had so often avoided now aimed squarely in her direction. Amara, watching from her seat, felt a mix of emotions. She appreciated the younger woman's support, but the confrontation had only added fuel to the fire. She could feel the tension in the cabin rising, the unspoken divide between those who sided with Lisa and those who sided with her. The plane jolted again, but this time the turbulence was human. The whispers grew louder, the glances more frequent. Lisa retreated to the galley, her composure unraveling. Amara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She had wanted to avoid a scene, but now the scene had found her. For the first time, she felt the weight of the moment shift. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone watching, everyone who had ever been in her shoes, everyone who had ever felt the sting of being told explicitly or implicitly that they didn't belong. And in that moment, Amara made a decision. She closed her book and stood, her movements deliberate. The cabin fell silent as she walked toward the galley, her presence commanding attention. Lisa looked up, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara's gaze was steady. "Yes," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You can start by listening." The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. The galley was a narrow space, its bright lights contrasting starkly with the muted tones of the cabin. Amara Blake stood just inside it, her presence commanding the attention of Lisa Warren, who now appeared smaller, more fragile, beneath the fluorescent glare. The hum of the engines provided a steady background, but it did nothing to mask the growing tension in the air. Lisa straightened her posture, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Ma'am," she began, her voice uneven, "I understand that you might have—" "No," Amara interrupted, her tone firm but not raised. "You don't understand, and that's the problem." Lisa's words faltered. The galley felt impossibly small, the walls closing in as Amara's calm but resolute demeanor pressed against her. "This isn't just about what you said," Amara continued. "It's about what you assumed. About who you assumed I was." Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but Amara held up a hand, silencing her. The passengers nearest to the galley were now openly listening, their gazes flicking between the two women. The younger woman with purple hair had her phone out again, the lens trained on the confrontation, capturing every second. Amara exhaled, her voice softening but not losing its edge. "I've spent my life walking into rooms where people have already decided who I am. Before I speak, before I act, before I even sit down, they've made up their minds. And most of the time, I let it go. I have to. Otherwise, I'd spend my life fighting battles I didn't start." Lisa's face flushed, the words striking like sharp, deliberate blows. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't that kind of person. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about intention. It was about impact. "But tonight," Amara said, her voice rising slightly, the emotion breaking through her calm exterior, "I can't let it go. Not here. Not now." Lisa's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. She could feel the stares from the cabin, the judgment weighing on her. Her chest tightened with a mix of shame and frustration. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "It's not about what you meant," Amara replied, her words cutting through the air like glass. "It's about what you did. And not just to me, but to everyone watching. Because when you question whether I belong here, you're telling them it's okay to question it, too." The tension was palpable now, the kind that pressed into your skin and made you want to look away but couldn't. The silver-haired man from earlier leaned forward in his seat, his brow furrowed. His wife clutched her armrest, her expression a mix of discomfort and quiet agreement. Lisa swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she tried to respond. I didn't realize." "No," Amara said, her voice sharp but steady. "You didn't, and that's the point." The hum of the engine seemed louder now, filling the silence that followed Amara's words. Lisa's breath hitched, her mind racing. She wanted to say something, anything, to make it right, but every word felt insufficient, every excuse hollow. "I've read about people like you," Lisa said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I mean your book, Rise Above. It helped me through a tough time." Amara's expression didn't change, but her silence invited Lisa to continue. Lisa's hands trembled as she gripped the counter, the weight of her admission settling over her. "My sister passed away last year," Lisa said, her voice cracking. I didn't know how to move forward. Your book, it gave me hope. It made me believe that I could be better." Amara's gaze softened slightly, but her posture remained firm. "And yet, here we are." The words landed like a hammer, and Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to treat you that way. I didn't mean to judge you." "But you did," Amara said, her voice quieter now but no less powerful. "And that judgment didn't come from nowhere. It came from something deeper, something you've never had to confront. That's what needs to change." The younger woman with the phone stepped forward then, her voice firm but not unkind. "Maybe it's time we all start confronting it," she said, addressing not just Lisa but the entire cabin. "Because this isn't just her problem. It's all of ours." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Passengers shifted in their seats, their discomfort now mingled with a quiet resolve. The silver-haired man nodded slightly, his wife murmuring, "She's right." Lisa looked down, her hands trembling. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A glimmer of hope. She looked up at Amara, her voice steady for the first time. "You're right," she said, "and I want to do better." Amara studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then start now." Lisa exhaled shakily, the weight of her own biases and mistakes pressing down on her. She turned to the younger woman. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of sincerity. The woman nodded. "It's a start." Amara returned to her seat, the tension in the cabin slowly dissolving. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, quiet reflections, and the faint stirrings of change. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered, reshaping the space it had left behind. And as the plane continued its journey through the night sky, so too did the journey of everyone aboard, carrying with them the lessons of that moment, the weight of assumptions, the power of accountability, and the quiet, unrelenting demand for justice. The cabin, still heavy with the residue of confrontation, began to stir again. The soft hum of the engines was a backdrop to murmured conversations, curious glances, and the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Amara Blake returned to her seat, her composure intact, but her thoughts turbulent. She had spent her life navigating moments like this, moments where silence felt complicit. But speaking up made her vulnerable. This time, though, she had spoken, and the weight of her words still hung in the air. Lisa Warren remained in the galley, her hands braced against the counter. Her chest heaved as she fought to steady her breath. The apology had been a start, but it hadn't absolved her. She knew that. Her mistakes were too fresh, her biases too deeply rooted. What was she supposed to do next? How could she begin to fix something so fractured? Behind her, the younger flight attendant, Mark, stepped into the galley. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Lisa nodded quickly, too quickly. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped, but the tears welling in her eyes betrayed her. Mark hesitated, then leaned closer. "Look," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know what's going on in your head right now. But that woman, she's not just a passenger. She's someone people look up to. You've got a chance to make this right. Don't waste it." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat tight. Mark's words pierced through her defensiveness, leaving her exposed. She nodded again, this time slower, more deliberate. "Thanks," she whispered, though the gratitude felt hollow in her mouth. She wasn't sure she deserved it. Back in her seat, Amara opened her laptop again, trying to focus on the presentation she needed to deliver the next day. But the words on the screen blurred as her mind replayed the scene in the galley. She thought of her mother, Grace, who had always told her that change wasn't just about speaking truth, it was about making people listen. Did she listen? Amara wondered. Did I make her understand? Across the aisle, the silver-haired man leaned toward his wife. "I think she handled that well," he murmured. His wife nodded. "Better than I would have. But it shouldn't have come to that." The man sighed, his gaze drifting toward Lisa, who was still in the galley. "People don't change overnight," he said, "but maybe she'll think twice next time." The younger woman with purple hair, still holding her phone, turned in her seat to face them. "Thinking twice isn't enough," she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "People like her have to unlearn years of this stuff. And it's on all of us to call it out when we see it." Her words sparked a ripple of agreement from nearby passengers. One by one, they began to share their thoughts, some hesitant, others emboldened by the moment. "It's everywhere," said an older man in the row behind Amara. "I've seen it at work, at church, even in my own family. We don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about it because it makes people uncomfortable," added a woman across the aisle. "But staying quiet doesn't fix anything." Amara listened, her heart heavy but hopeful. These were the conversations she had always wanted her work to spark. But they were happening now, in the confined space of an airplane cabin, where every word carried weight and every silence spoke volumes. Lisa emerged from the galley then, her steps hesitant but purposeful. She moved down the aisle, pausing briefly beside Amara's seat. "Ms. Blake," she began, her voice trembling, "may I speak with you again? Privately." Amara looked up, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded, closing her laptop and standing. The cabin watched as the two women moved toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the cockpit. Inside the small space, Lisa's hands fidgeted at her sides. I needed to say this away from everyone else. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to know that I'm not proud of how I acted. I've been thinking about what you said. About assumptions and how they shape our actions. And you're right. I made assumptions about you, assumptions I didn't even realize I had. Amara crossed her arms, her gaze steady. And now that you realize it, what are you going to do about it? The question landed like a blow. And Lisa's breath caught. She had expected forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement of her apology. But Amara wasn't letting her off the hook. And deep down, Lisa knew she was right not to. I don't know, Lisa admitted, her voice breaking, but I want to figure it out. I want to do better. Amara studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That's a start, she said, but words are easy. Action is harder. Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I'll figure it out, she said again, this time with more conviction. The plane jolted slightly as it hit another patch of turbulence. But neither woman moved. The storm outside mirrored the one inside the cabin, a storm of reckoning, of confrontation, of the slow, painful work of change. As Amara returned to her seat, the cabin felt different. The tension wasn't gone, but it had shifted, softened. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful, reflective. The younger woman with purple hair lowered her phone, her lips curling into a faint smile. Even the silver-haired man and his wife seemed lighter, their earlier discomfort giving way to quiet hope. The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet, but the conversations lingered, unspoken but present. Lisa continued her duties, her movements more deliberate, her gaze less guarded. Amara returned to her laptop, her fingers finally steady as she typed. When the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for arrival. As the wheels touched down, the passengers sat in silence, the weight of the journey, not just the flight, but the events it had carried, settling over them. As Amara gathered her belongings, Lisa approached her one last time. Thank you, she said quietly, for your patience, for your honesty. Amara nodded, her expression softening. Good luck, she said. You'll need it. Lisa smiled faintly, the words landing as both a challenge and a gift. As Amara stepped off the plane, the whispers began again, but this time they were different. They weren't whispers of judgment or curiosity, they were whispers of possibility, of change. And as she walked through the terminal, her book clutched tightly in her hand, Amara knew that this journey, this flight, was just the beginning. Amara Blake stepped into the terminal, the weight of the flight still pressing against her chest. She clutched her bag tighter, her mind replaying the moments on the plane like a film she couldn't turn off. The murmur of the passengers, Lisa's trembling apology, the whispered judgment, it all clung to her like a second skin. She had fought too many battles like this, yet this one felt different. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who watched, everyone who stayed silent, and everyone who dared to speak. As she approached the baggage claim, her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw dozens of notifications lighting up the screen. Messages, emails, and social media alerts. At first, she thought it might be related to her upcoming meeting. But then she opened one of the messages from a colleague. Have you seen this? You're trending. Her stomach tightened as she clicked the link. A video began to play, a shaky recording from the plane, showing Amara in the galley with Lisa, her voice calm but firm as she confronted the flight attendant. The caption read, "When dignity meets ignorance. A lesson in accountability at 30,000 feet." The video had already amassed thousands of views. Comments flooded the screen, ranging from admiration to outrage to defensive dismissals. This is what grace under pressure looks like. Another example of playing the race card. Enough already. She handled that with more composure than I ever could. Inspiring. Why do people always have to make it about race? Amara's pulse quickened. She had spent her career navigating public scrutiny. But this felt different. This was raw, unfiltered, and unfolding in real time. She closed the app and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind racing. At the same time, Lisa Warren sat alone in the employee break room at the airport. Her shift had ended, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her own phone, her face pale as she watched the video. She didn't remember the younger woman filming, but there it was, her mistake, her shame, laid bare for the world to see. Her stomach churned as she read the comments beneath the video. Some defended her, chalking it up to an innocent misunderstanding. But others were less forgiving. Typical. She didn't think she'd get caught. Imagine how many times she's done this before. She shouldn't just apologize. She should lose her job. Lisa's breath hitched. She had thought the worst was over when she apologized to Amara. But this was something else. The world was watching now. And it demanded more than just remorse. Her phone buzzed with a call from her manager. Lisa hesitated, staring at the screen before reluctantly answering. Lisa, her manager said. Her voice clipped. We need to talk. Now. The tension continued to mount as Amara stepped into the conference room the next morning for her meeting. The space was sleek and modern. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the Chicago skyline. But Amara barely noticed. The weight of the video and the storm it had unleashed loomed large in her mind. The meeting began, her team presenting their plans for the scholarship fund's expansion. Amara tried to focus, but the looks exchanged by the board members were hard to ignore. Finally, one of them spoke up. Ms. Blake, the woman said, adjusting her glasses, before we continue, I feel compelled to address the incident that's been making headlines. It's admirable how you handled yourself. But I have to ask, do you think this kind of attention might overshadow the work we're trying to do here? Amara froze, the question hitting her like a slap. She straightened her posture, forcing herself to remain calm. If anything, she said, her voice steady, this attention underscores why our work is necessary. It's not just about providing scholarships, it's about breaking down the barriers that make scholarships necessary in the first place. The room fell silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, the board members nodded, their initial skepticism giving way to understanding. But Amara knew the fight wasn't over. The video had become a lightning rod. And it was only a matter of time before the storm grew stronger. By midday, the video had gone viral, making headlines across the country. News anchors debated the encounter, using it as a springboard to discuss systemic racism and the subtleties of everyday prejudice. Social media erupted with hashtags. #dignity in flight. #rise above. #everyday bias. Amara watched the coverage from her hotel room, a mixture of pride and exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. But now that it was here, she felt a responsibility to use it. She drafted a statement for her publicist to release, one that acknowledged the incident while shifting focus to the broader issues at hand. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in her manager's office, her head bowed as she listened to the reprimand. Lisa, her manager said, her tone firm but not unkind. This isn't just about you anymore. The company is under scrutiny now. And we need to address this head on. You're going to have to make a public apology. Lisa's heart sank. She had already apologized to Amara. But this felt like being paraded before the world. Her mistakes magnified for all to see. I understand, she said quietly, though her voice betrayed her fear. Her manager nodded. We'll craft the statement together. But Lisa, this isn't just about damage control. You need to show people that you're committed to change. Lisa nodded, though her mind raced with doubts. Could she truly change? Or was this just an attempt to salvage her reputation? That evening, Lisa's public apology was released. She appeared in a short video, her face pale but resolute as she addressed the camera. I want to take full responsibility for my actions, she began, her voice trembling but steady. My words and assumptions were wrong, and I deeply regret the hurt I caused. I've learned a hard lesson about the impact of my biases, and I'm committed to doing the work to confront and change them. The response was mixed. Some praised her courage, while others dismissed the apology as performative. But for Lisa, it was a small, shaky step toward redemption. As the day drew to a close, Amara sat on the edge of her hotel bed, her book open in her lap. She thought about Lisa, about the passengers on the plane, about the countless people who had reached out to share their own stories of bias and resilience. The ripple effect of the flight was undeniable, its impact stretching far beyond the confines of the cabin. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. And she was ready for it. The days following the flight passed like a whirlwind, dragging Amara Blake into a storm she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. The viral video had become a national conversation, splashed across television screens, dissected on radio shows, and debated in countless online forums. Everyone seemed to have an opinion not just about what happened between her and Lisa Warren, but about what it represented, the unspoken, unacknowledged burden of everyday prejudice. Amara stood in the green room of a news studio, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror. Her face looked calm, composed, but her heart raced. She had done countless interviews in her career, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny sharper. "Ms. Blake, we're ready for you," a production assistant said, poking her head in. Amara took a deep breath, smoothed her blazer, and stepped into the bright lights of the studio. The host greeted her warmly, but Amara could feel the tension in the air. The segment was titled, "Race and Reckoning in the Skies: What One Viral Video Reveals About America Today." She took her seat, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Ms. Blake," the host began, her tone measured, "your confrontation with Lisa Warren has sparked a national debate. Some see it as a powerful moment of accountability, while others feel it's an overreaction. How do you respond to those who say this is just another example of people being too sensitive?" Amara's lips tightened for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't about sensitivity. It's about humanity. What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, one that millions of people face every day. A pattern of being questioned, doubted, or diminished simply because of how we look." The host nodded, but her next question came quickly. "Do you think Lisa Warren's public apology was enough?" Amara hesitated. She had watched Lisa's apology, noted the tremor in her voice, the visible weight of her shame. "I believe her apology was sincere," she said finally. "But apologies are only the first step. Real change requires action, personal and systemic." While Amara's words resonated with many, they also ignited a backlash. Online, the conversation grew more heated. Supporters of Lisa argued that she had been unfairly vilified, her life turned upside down for what they deemed a small mistake. "It was just a misunderstanding." One post read, "Why ruin someone's career over it?" Others pushed back fiercely. "A small mistake for her is a lifetime of indignities for people like Amara. When will we stop excusing this behavior?" The division wasn't just online. In workplaces, at dinner tables, and in community centers, the video became a flashpoint, forcing people to confront their own biases or avoid them altogether. Lisa Warren felt the weight of it all. Every headline, every comment, every glance from her colleagues was a reminder of her failure. She had returned to work, determined to move forward, but the whispers followed her everywhere. "She's the one from that video," a passenger murmured as Lisa walked down the aisle. "I hope she learned her lesson," another replied. Lisa kept her head down, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was trying, that she wasn't the person they thought she was. But the truth was, she didn't even know who she was anymore. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through the comments on her apology video. Some were supportive, but others were vicious. "You don't deserve a second chance." One comment read, "People like you never change." Lisa's chest tightened. She thought about the books she'd read, the workshops she'd signed up for in the days since the flight. She thought about Amara, her calm strength, her unflinching demand for accountability. Lisa wanted to be better, but the path felt impossibly steep. Meanwhile, Amara found herself inundated with messages not just from journalists, but from everyday people who shared their own stories of prejudice and resilience. One email, in particular, stood out. It was from a teacher in Kansas who had shown the video to her high school class. "My students were deeply moved." The email read, "We spent the entire class discussing what it means to confront bias, both in others and in ourselves. Thank you for sparking this conversation." Amara felt a swell of pride, but also a heavy responsibility. She hadn't asked to be thrust into the spotlight, but now that she was here, she knew she had to use her platform wisely. The next day, Amara and Lisa were both invited to speak at a community forum on racial bias and reconciliation. The event was held at a packed auditorium, with people from all walks of life filling the seats. Amara hesitated before accepting the invitation, unsure if Lisa would even show up. But when the evening arrived, Lisa was there, sitting nervously at the edge of the stage. The moderator introduced them, and the audience fell silent as Amara took the microphone. She spoke first, sharing her perspective with the same calm conviction that had captivated the nation. This isn't just about one flight, she said. It's about the systems and assumptions that make moments like that possible. It's about the courage to confront those assumptions. In ourselves and in others. When it was Lisa's turn. Her voice trembled as she began. I didn't see it at first. She admitted. I thought I was just doing my job. But the truth is, I was blind to my own biases. I'm still learning. Still trying to unlearn years of ingrained assumptions. And it's hard, but it's necessary. The room was silent for a moment. Then a soft ripple of applause began, growing louder and louder until the entire audience was on its feet. Amara and Lisa exchanged a glance, one filled with the weight of their shared journey, and the hope that their story could be a catalyst for change. As the night ended, Amara stood by the auditorium doors, greeting attendees as they left. An older man approached her, his face lined with age and emotion. Thank you, he said, his voice thick. I've spent my whole life not seeing what was right in front of me. But tonight, you opened my eyes. Amara smiled, her heart heavy but hopeful. The fight wasn't over. It might never be. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of progress, slow, painful, but undeniably present. The forum had ended, but the air still buzzed with the energy of shared truths and raw revelations. Amara Blake lingered near the stage, her thoughts swirling. Lisa Warren had left quietly, slipping into the shadows of the auditorium, but her trembling words still echoed in Amara's ears. I'm still learning, still trying to unlearn years of ingrained assumptions. It was a start, Amara thought, but starting wasn't enough. Change required more than words. It demanded action, accountability, and persistence in the face of discomfort. The next morning, Amara awoke to another storm brewing. The video of the forum had gone viral, with clips of Lisa's vulnerable admission and Amara's piercing speech being dissected by commentators on every major news outlet. The responses were as divided as they were impassioned. She's brave for admitting her faults. Some said of Lisa, she's just trying to save face. Others countered. As for Amara, the praise was tempered by criticism. She's a hero for holding people accountable. Read one post. She's exploiting the situation for attention. Read another. Amara sighed as she scrolled through the noise. She had known this would happen. Moments of truth had a way of making people uncomfortable, and discomfort often turned into anger. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the dim light of her laptop illuminating her face. She had been called into a meeting with the airline's HR department later that afternoon, and she felt a gnawing sense of dread. Her colleagues whispered judgments, the icy stares from passengers. She couldn't escape the weight of what she'd done. Or, perhaps more accurately, the weight of what she'd represented. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. It was a text from Mark, the younger flight attendant who had been her quiet support since the incident. Mark, you okay? HR meetings are tough. But remember, you're doing the work. That matters. Lisa stared at the message for a long moment before typing a brief response. Lisa, thanks. I don't know if it's enough. Though, at the HR meeting, Lisa was greeted by two stern-looking managers and a representative from the airline's diversity and inclusion team. The conversation was direct, uncomfortable, and unrelenting. Lisa, the airline's reputation has taken a significant hit, one manager said, his tone clipped. We're receiving both backlash and support, but the scrutiny on your actions has put us in a difficult position. Lisa nodded, her throat dry. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. We're not here to punish you. The diversity officer interjected, her tone softer but no less firm. But we are here to ensure that this incident becomes a turning point not just for you, but for the organization as a whole. The officer outlined a series of steps: mandatory bias training, participation in workshops on empathy and inclusion, and a requirement to share her story publicly as part of the airline's new initiative to address systemic prejudice. Lisa felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She was being given a chance to redeem herself, but the road ahead felt impossibly daunting. At the same time, Amara was on a conference call with leaders from several national organizations. The conversation was meant to focus on her scholarship fund, but the discussion quickly turned to the fallout from the viral video. Amara, this is an opportunity to amplify your message, one leader said. You've got the nation's attention. How do we capitalize on this moment? Amara hesitated. She didn't want to exploit the incident for personal gain. But she couldn't ignore the power of the platform she'd been given. "It's not about capitalizing," she said finally. "It's about creating meaningful change. That means more than just talking. It means action." The leaders nodded, their faces resolute. Plans began to form. Town halls, partnerships with corporations, and a national campaign to address unconscious bias in workplaces. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. Conservative commentators accused Amara of sowing division. Social media lit up with hashtags both for and against her. Protesters picketed the airline's headquarters, some demanding Lisa's firing, others decrying what they called cancel culture. Amara's inbox overflowed with messages, some thanking her for her bravery, others filled with vitriol. One email in particular struck her. It was from a man in Texas who had once been a staunch defender of traditional values. "I've spent my whole life ignoring conversations about race," the email read, "but your words at the forum hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I'm questioning things I've taken for granted. Thank you for opening my eyes." Amara read the email twice, her heart heavy. For every step forward, there would be resistance, but moments like this reminded her why she had to keep going. Lisa, meanwhile, stood in front of a room filled with her colleagues, her palms sweating as she prepared to share her story for the first time. The airline had launched a new initiative called Fly with Empathy, and Lisa had been asked to be its first speaker. She gripped the podium, her voice shaking as she began. "I didn't see it," she admitted. "I didn't see how my own biases shaped the way I treated people. I thought I was doing my job. But what I was really doing was upholding a system that makes people feel like they don't belong." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Lisa's vulnerability was raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. By the time she finished, there were tears in her eyes and in the eyes of many in the audience. As the weeks passed, the ripples of the incident continued to spread. Amara and Lisa found themselves inextricably linked, their stories intertwined in ways neither had anticipated. Together, they began to forge a path forward not as adversaries, but as unlikely allies in the fight for understanding and accountability. The journey was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more resistance, more moments that demanded courage and resilience. But for the first time, both women felt a glimmer of hope, because the fire they had ignited was no longer theirs to carry alone. It had become a beacon, lighting the way for others to follow. The auditorium buzzed with murmurs as Amara Blake adjusted the microphone on the podium. Rows of expectant faces stretched before her students. Educators, activists, even corporate executives. The Fly with Empathy initiative had brought them here, united by the promise of dialogue. But Amara knew that promises alone couldn't break the walls built by centuries of division. She glanced at Lisa Warren, seated in the front row. Lisa's shoulders were stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of public scrutiny had left visible marks on her, lines of tension on her face. A nervous energy that radiated even in stillness. Amara took a breath, steadying herself. If they were going to confront the unspoken truths that bound them together, it had to start now. "Thank you all for being here," Amara began, her voice calm but firm. "We've gathered to talk about something that many would rather avoid, something that makes us uncomfortable, defensive, and, at times, ashamed. But discomfort is not our enemy. Silence is." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses down, demanding to be filled. Lisa sat motionless, Amara's words slicing through her like cold wind. She had agreed to speak later in the program, but the thought of standing before this audience filled her with dread. Would they see her as genuine? Or just another face in the long line of people who apologize, promise to change, and quietly retreat into the shadows? The months since the flight had been a whirlwind of accountability. She'd attended workshops, read books on systemic racism, and participated in countless discussions. Yet, each step felt like trudging through quicksand. No matter how far she moved, the past clung to her, dragging her back. Amara continued, her tone sharpening as she built momentum. "Every person in this room has biases. That's not an accusation, it's a reality. But the question we must ask ourselves is this: what are we doing about them? Are we excusing them as harmless? Or are we confronting the harm they cause?" The crowd stirred, the weight of her words rippling through the room. In the back, a middle-aged man crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face a mask of skepticism. Nearby, a younger woman nodded, her expression determined. Amara saw it all, the push and pull, the discomfort and resolve. It mirrored the battle she had faced her entire life, fighting to be seen. Not as a stereotype or a symbol, but as a human being. When it was Lisa's turn to speak, she approached the stage with hesitant steps. Her heart pounded as she took her place behind the podium, the lights glaring down on her like a spotlight in an interrogation room. She gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white. "I'm not an expert," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm not here to teach you or to excuse myself. I'm here because I made a mistake rooted in assumptions I didn't even realize I was making." She paused, scanning the room. The audience was watching intently, some with arms crossed, others leaning forward. Lisa forced herself to keep going. "I used to think that bias was something other people had," she said. "I told myself that I was kind, fair, professional. But kindness isn't enough when your assumptions harm someone else. Fairness isn't enough when it's filtered through blind spots you refuse to acknowledge." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, the words spilling out like a confession. "When I questioned whether Amara belonged in first class, I wasn't just doubting her. I was upholding a system that makes people like her prove their worth over and over again. And for that, I'm sorry." The room was still, the audience holding their breath. Lisa's apology felt different this time, not rehearsed or performative, but raw, unvarnished. Amara watched her closely, a flicker of something pride, perhaps softening the edges of her expression. When Lisa finished, the audience erupted into cautious applause. Some clapped politely, while others stood, their faces etched with emotion. Lisa stepped off the stage, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She had done it, but the weight of change still loomed large. The event ended, but the conversations continued in hushed tones and spirited debates. Amara lingered near the stage, greeting attendees who approached her with tearful eyes and heartfelt stories. One woman, her voice trembling, said, "I've been on both sides of this. Thank you for giving us a way to talk about it." Nearby, Lisa stood alone, watching the crowd from a distance. She wanted to leave, to slip out unnoticed, but something rooted her in place. A young man approached her, his expression hesitant. "Ms. Warren," he said, his voice low, "I just wanted to say, thank you. My mom's faced moments like the one you created for Amara. She always says nothing will ever change. But hearing you own up to it, maybe it will." Lisa blinked, the words sinking deep. "Thank you," she whispered. "I hope so." The next morning, the headlines were unrelenting. Some celebrated the event as a powerful step forward. When accountability meets grace, a night of reckoning. Others were less forgiving. From viral to virtuous? The thin line between redemption and performance. Amara and Lisa read the coverage separately, each feeling the weight of public opinion. But they knew the work wasn't about headlines or applause. It was about the quiet, relentless effort to dismantle systems built on prejudice. That evening, Amara sat at her desk, pen in hand. She wrote not for an audience, but for herself, a way to process the storms swirling around her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a flood breaking through a dam. "Change," she wrote, "isn't linear. It's messy, painful, and often thankless, but it is necessary, and it begins not with grand gestures, but with small, unyielding acts of courage." Across town, Lisa sat in her apartment, scrolling through a list of upcoming workshops and community events. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope, not that she could erase her mistakes, but that she could learn from them, and maybe, just maybe, help others do the same. The journey ahead was daunting, but for both women, the path was clear. The work of change was far from over, but they had taken the first steps. Together, they had turned a moment of conflict into a movement for understanding, a movement that, they hoped, would ripple far beyond the walls of that plane. The days following the event were both quiet and loud, a paradox that only a moment like this could produce. For Amara Blake, the quiet came in the rare moments when she sat alone in her apartment, away from the noise of headlines and debates. But the world beyond her door was loud, its cacophony demanding she take notice. Conversations rippled across the country, some hopeful, others blistering. The nation had been shown its reflection, and not everyone liked what they saw. For Lisa Warren, the noise was internal. The forums, the workshops, the public apologies, they were steps forward. But each one brought new realizations that shook her foundation. The reckoning was far from over. Each day, she woke to a new headline. A new comment dissecting her every word, every action, and with each passing moment, the tension grew. Amara was invited to speak at a televised town hall, a platform meant to bridge the widening divide. She hesitated, knowing how these events often played out more spectacle than substance. But after much deliberation, she agreed. When the day arrived, the studio was packed with a carefully curated audience: educators, activists, corporate leaders, and community members from different walks of life. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone had come armed with opinions they were ready to unleash. The host, a seasoned journalist, opened the event with a pointed question. Ms. Blake, some have called your confrontation with Lisa Warren a defining moment in our country's ongoing conversation about race. Others have called it performative. How do you respond to those who say this entire situation has been blown out of proportion? Amara's heart steadied, her resolve unshaken. What happened on that flight was not unique, she said. It was a reflection of the subtle, often unspoken ways prejudice operates in our daily lives. If this conversation feels uncomfortable, it's because it's long overdue. The room was silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. Lisa sat in the audience, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She had agreed to attend, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was a sense of duty. Or perhaps she wanted to see if the work she'd been doing had any meaning at all. But as she listened to Amara, she felt both inspired and exposed. When the host turned to Lisa, the spotlight felt like a weight pressing her into the chair. Ms. Warren, you've faced immense public scrutiny since the incident. What have you learned from this experience? Lisa hesitated, her voice trembling as she began. I've learned that good intentions aren't enough. I thought I was being fair, professional, but I wasn't seeing the harm my actions caused. This experience has forced me to confront my biases not just in that moment on the plane, but in how I've lived my entire life. Her voice grew steadier. It's not easy to admit you've been part of the problem, but if I've learned anything, it's that change begins with accountability. As the town hall progressed, the tension in the room grew sharper. A man in the audience stood, his face set in a deep frown. I'm tired of being blamed for things I didn't do, he said, his voice tinged with anger. I wasn't on that plane. I didn't say anything wrong. Why should people like me have to carry this guilt? Amara met his gaze, her own calm but resolute. This isn't about guilt, she said. It's about responsibility. None of us chose the systems we were born into, but we all have a choice in whether we perpetuate them. The question isn't, did you build this system? The question is, what are you doing to dismantle it? The man's expression faltered, the weight of her words pressing against his defiance. But not everyone was convinced. Others in the audience murmured in agreement with him, their discomfort turning into resistance. The turning point came when a young black woman stood to speak. Her voice was steady but laced with emotion. Every day, I walk into rooms where I have to prove I belong, she said. Every time someone like Lisa questions someone like Amara, it sends a message. You don't deserve to be here. That message doesn't just disappear when the flight ends. It stays with us, shaping how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. Her words sparked applause from some and uneasy silence from others. Lisa felt the heat of the moment, the undeniable truth that her actions had been part of a larger, insidious pattern. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but instead, she stood. I sent that message, Lisa said, her voice cracking, and I can't take it back. But I can promise to do everything I can to stop sending it. Not just for Amara, but for everyone. The room erupted into applause. Though it was tempered by the gravity of the conversation, the tension remained, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of something else: understanding. As the event ended, Amara and Lisa found themselves standing side by side, the weight of the night settling over them. That was brave, Amara said quietly, her gaze softening as she looked at Lisa. So was that, Lisa replied, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. They left the studio together, the night air cool against their faces. Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, some holding signs of support, others brandishing messages of anger and defiance. The sight was a stark reminder of how far they still had to go. Amara turned to Lisa, her expression thoughtful. The fight isn't over. Lisa nodded. But maybe we've started something. In the days that followed, the town hall became the centerpiece of a national conversation. News outlets played clips of Amara and Lisa side by side, their unlikely partnership sparking both hope and controversy. Schools and workplaces began hosting discussions inspired by the event, while critics accused the two women of perpetuating division. Through it all, Amara remained resolute. She knew the work ahead would be grueling, that progress would come in fits and starts. But she also knew that change was possible because she had seen it, however small, in Lisa. Lisa, for her part, continued her journey of unlearning and accountability. She knew she would never erase her mistakes, but she was determined to use them as a foundation for growth. And while the weight of her past still lingered, it no longer defined her. Together, they had exposed a fault line in the fabric of society. But more importantly, they had shown that even the deepest divides could be bridged if only people were willing to face the truth. The tension in the air was unmistakable as Amara Blake arrived at the university auditorium. It was the largest event yet, a national symposium on systemic bias and the subtle ways it pervaded everyday life. The stakes felt higher than ever. Leaders from across industries, educators, activists, and skeptics alike filled the room, their faces expectant but guarded. This wasn't just another conversation, it was a moment poised on the edge of confrontation and revelation. Lisa Warren stood backstage, her hands shaking as she adjusted the microphone clip to her blazer. She had been invited to speak again, not as a symbol of redemption, but as a case study in accountability. The weight of the past months pressed heavily on her, each step of her journey marked by public scrutiny and private soul-searching. She caught a glimpse of Amara across the stage, her calm presence like a steadying anchor amidst Lisa's storm of nerves. "You'll define, Mark," her fellow flight attendant whispered as he passed her a glass of water. "Just speak from the heart. That's what people need." Lisa nodded, but her heart raced. What would the audience see when they looked at her, a person trying to make amends? Or a reminder of the harm that still festered in the world? The event began with Amara's keynote speech. She stood tall and composed, her voice clear and measured as she spoke about the invisible chains that bias placed on society. "Bias is not always loud," she said, her words reverberating through the hall. "Sometimes it's quiet. It lives in the hesitation before a handshake, in the extra glance at a boarding pass, in the unspoken doubt that someone belongs. And when we fail to name it, we allow it to grow." The room was silent, her words settling like heavy stones in the hearts of those listening. Amara scanned the crowd, her gaze lingering on a group of corporate executives seated near the front. Their faces were a mix of interest and discomfort. She could almost hear their thoughts. What does this mean for us? What will we have to change? When Lisa took the stage, the energy in the room shifted. The air grew taut, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She gripped the edges of the podium, her voice unsteady as she began. "I'm not here to defend myself," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm here to tell you how I failed and how I'm trying to do better." She recounted the flight, the assumptions she had made, the words she couldn't take back. "In that moment, I wasn't just a flight attendant. I was a gatekeeper, and I didn't even realize it. But ignorance isn't an excuse. It's a barrier, and it's my job to break it down." The audience listened intently, their expressions shifting from judgment to something softer, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Then the questions began. A young woman in the audience raised her hand, her voice sharp with emotion. "You say you're learning, but what about the people who've been hurt along the way? What do you say to them?" Lisa's breath hitched, but she met the woman's gaze. "I say I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling, "and I say I'll keep working to make sure it doesn't happen again, not just for me, but for the systems I'm part of." The response was met with murmurs, some approving, others doubtful. The tide of opinion was shifting, but it wasn't uniform. Some were ready to forgive, others to fight. As the discussion deepened, tensions rose. A middle-aged man stood, his voice booming with frustration. "I'm tired of being blamed for things I didn't do," he said. "Why should I feel guilty for something I wasn't even part of?" Amara stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't about guilt," she said. "It's about responsibility. You didn't build the house, but if you live in it, you have a responsibility to fix the leaks." The man hesitated, his anger softening as her words sank in. But the room was far from settled. A woman in the back stood, her voice breaking as she recounted her own experiences of being dismissed and doubted. Her story sparked others. the room transforming into a raw, emotional exchange of pain and accountability. By the end of the event, the auditorium felt like a battlefield not of violence, but of reckoning. The conversations were messy, unfiltered, and necessary. People left with their perspectives challenged, their assumptions shaken. Amara and Lisa stood together in the aftermath, the echoes of the day still ringing in their ears. "That was intense," Lisa said, her voice shaky but resolute. "It was," Amara agreed, "but change always is." As they left the stage, they knew the work was far from over. The tide was rising, and with it, the possibility of something new, a world where bias wasn't ignored, but confronted, where accountability wasn't feared, but embraced, where change wasn't just a distant hope, but a present, powerful reality. The train station was quiet in the early hours, its echoing halls filled only with the soft shuffle of footsteps and the low hum of an arriving locomotive. Amara Blake sat on a wooden bench near the platform, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The crisp morning air was heavy with the weight of the previous night's symposium. The emotions, the arguments, the small victories, all of it still churned within her. She watched as commuters passed by, their faces weary, their steps hurried. Each one carried stories she'd never know, struggles she could only imagine. But that was the crux of it, wasn't it? The invisible threads that connected them all. Threads so easily ignored until they pulled too tight. Lisa Warren approached from across the platform, her face pale but determined. She had hesitated before agreeing to meet Amara here, unsure if she could face her outside the carefully structured events where they had been thrown together. But this felt different. It felt necessary. Amara looked up and nodded. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. Lisa sat down beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. She hesitated, then added, "I wasn't sure if I should come." Amara sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And yet, you're here. That's something." Lisa sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. "I feel like I'm constantly walking a tightrope. No matter what I say or do, someone thinks it's not enough or too much. That's because it isn't about you," Amara said bluntly, though her tone lacked malice. "It's about the systems we live in. The fight isn't about one person, it's about all of us." Lisa flinched but nodded. "I know. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly get it." Amara turned to face her, her expression softening. "The fact that you're asking that question means you're starting to." Later that day, Amara and Lisa attended the final event of their shared journey, a community dialogue hosted in a modest church basement. Unlike the polished venues they'd grown accustomed to, this space was raw, unfiltered. Folding chairs formed a loose circle, and the walls were lined with posters promoting equality and justice. The attendees were locals, teachers, factory workers, retirees, and students. The air was thick with a mix of curiosity and guardedness. An older man in the corner, his face weathered with time, spoke first. "I've lived in this town my whole life," he said, his voice steady but gruff. "Seen a lot of changes. Some good, some bad. But what I don't understand is why we're still fighting the same fights my parents did. Why can't we just move on?" Amara leaned forward, her hands resting on her knees. "Because the fight isn't over," she said. "The systems that upheld injustice didn't disappear, they adapted. And pretending they don't exist only allows them to thrive." The man nodded slowly, though his expression remained skeptical. As the discussion continued, tensions began to rise. A young woman, her voice shaking with anger, stood and directed her words at Lisa. "People like you get to apologize and move on. But people like me have to live with the consequences of your actions every day. How is that fair?" Lisa's face flushed, but she didn't shy away. "You're right," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. "It's not fair, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I'm here because I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." The woman crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly but not entirely. "Then prove it," she said. The room grew heavier as more people shared their stories. An elderly black woman recounted the indignities she had endured over decades, being followed in stores, dismissed in meetings, ignored in moments that mattered most. A young man spoke of the subtle biases he witnessed at work. The jokes that weren't jokes. The promotions that never came. Each story was a stone added to the weight of the room. But with each one, The invisible barriers between the attendees began to crack. Amara listened intently, her heart aching but resolute. She knew that conversations like this, messy, raw, and often painful, were the first steps toward something greater. As the evening wore on, the tension began to shift. A man who had been silent for most of the event finally spoke. His voice low and hesitant. "I didn't think I'd come tonight," he admitted. "Didn't think it was my place. But hearing all of this, it's made me realize how much I've ignored. How much I've let slide because it didn't affect me. I want to do better." The room was quiet for a moment. Then a ripple of agreement passed through the circle. It wasn't resolution, but it was a start. After the event, Amara and Lisa stood outside in the cool night air. The street lights cast long shadows, and the distant hum of traffic filled the silence between them. "That was hard," Lisa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara nodded. "Change always is." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. Lisa broke the silence. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Amara turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Not every battle ends in victory," she said, "but every battle fought moves us closer." Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Amara's smile grew, her voice soft but firm. "Don't thank me yet. The road ahead is long." As they parted ways, each carrying the lessons of the day, the faint glow of hope lingered in the air. The work was far from over, but the journey they had started together had already begun to ripple outward, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet see. And so, they walked forward toward the uncertain, often daunting horizon of change, knowing that every step, no matter how small, mattered.